how I kind of want to do this is read the original text and then talk through talk through it. But we're not going to read all of it, of course. But we're not even going to read. We're aiming to read essentially the first quarter of the text. But there's some stuff in here we're going to skip over as well to kind of make it work.
Were you yourself, Phaedo, and the person with Socrates on the day when he drank the poison?
Yes, Ishikret, I was.
I wish that you would tell me about his death. What did he say in his last hours? We were informed that he died by taking poison, but no one knew anything more, for no Philesian ever goes to Athens now. And a long time has elapsed since any Athenian found his way to Philus. Therefore, we had no clear accounts.
Did you not hear of the proceedings at the trial?
Yes, someone told us about the trial, and we could not understand why. Having been condemned, he was put to death as appeared, not at the time, but long afterwards. What was the reason of this?
An accident, Ishikret. The reason was that the stern of the ship, which the Athenians sent to Delos, happened to have been crowned on the day before he was tried.
Okay, perfect. We're going to pause here real quick. Okay, so does anybody know any background information about this?
Basically, Socrates is this guy who, philosopher, likes to question people, basically tackles their presumed assumptions and questions them, does what's called now the Socratic method, which he constantly questions them to the point where they start questioning their own premises and beliefs to get them to either come to his side or they both come to some sort of synthesis or something like that. I guess during the after effects of the I think it was the Peloponnesian War, and there was it imposed by Sparta onto Athens a year or so where 30 tyrants just basically had control.
But Socrates essentially, in many ways, is thought of as the father of philosophy today. Obviously, that's also attributed to Plato, but you have this really interesting kind of set of teachers where Socrates actually kind of instructs Plato, not in any official capacity. So we don't actually know whether Socrates, for example, could read or write. We have no written documents left by Socrates today. I think I would actually guess that many people would lean in the directions that he probably couldn't read or write, for example, but spent his days philosophizing on the Agora of Athens, and basically had a youth movement that followed him and kind of, let themselves be educated through him. Plato is one of those people. The point that I was going to make here is, and Plato then goes on to actually, in a very official capacity, educate Aristotle, and then Aristotle goes on in a very official capacity also to educate Alexander the Great. So anybody who, and Alexander the Great, unlike Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, is very much not an academic, or he's a thinker, but he's very much like a doer. What he's famous for is essentially conquering an area that extends all the way to modern India, and so if it definitely also teaches you the kind of value of education in a different sense that, I'm sure that the guy who was educated, tutored very directly by Aristotle, had the you can understand how there's something about that really empowered him to go out and do other amazing things outside of the realm of academia as well. But anyways, that's just a side note. The point I wanted to make here, so what is it, Seth, that Socrates is actually on trial for in the city of Athens?
So, if I remember correctly, there's two main points. One is, I think in different translations, it's either impiety or atheism. And
Right.
the other one is corruption of the youth.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. So he believes in gods not sanctioned by the state and is introducing new deities, and absolutely, and corrupting the youth kind of with his teaching, questioning traditional like values and beliefs. And so, yeah, those are the two things. So basically, it's very clear from Plato's writings that Plato views this as an injustice, that Socrates is being put to death. And I actually don't even want to go. We've already talked more than I wanted to spend on this already. Socrates is being put to death, and Plato thinks that's an injustice. And one of the things that we hear right here is that that Socrates was actually supposed to be put to death right after essentially the trial, right after he in the Athenian court, actually in a 1-day trial. That's all you could get. After his 1-day trial gives him a guilty verdict, why he was not immediately kind of put to death, essentially, for example, the next day, as was the custom, but it took a while. One of the reasons is, or actually the reason is, that there is a ship that returns from Delos, where an oracle is, and that ship, it's going to say right here, basically, the whole period is the whole period of the voyage is a holy season, which is not allowed to be polluted by public executions. And so basically, Socrates is kind of saved by the gods, and you can kind of sense already right here. You definitely get theistic indications from Plato right here, that he's indicating subtly that there is some kind of underlying meaning and purpose and structure, divine structure of the universe that is involved in kind of that affects what actually happens there. And two, we're also hearing kind of theologically, if I can use that word, views the death as an injustice. But that's neither here nor there, actually. I mean, it just kind of warms us up and puts us kind of into the mode of the story. So let me pause here. Actually, that was already a lot. Valentine, how are you doing? We're gonna jump ahead here a little bit in a second.
I'm okay. I'm listening.
Okay, cool. Do you know a lot about Socrates, Plato, Socrates and Plato, or not a ton?
I know about them. I've read a bit of Plato's work, but especially the Republic, and I knew that Socrates is a famous philosopher, but didn't write anything.
Mm-hmm.
And I knew that he was Plato's master, and Plato was the master of Aristotle. So I'm interested in the history of thought and philosophy. So I knew about that, and I know that Socrates' end was a bit dramatic, and that he was trialed and judged for part of what he did. I haven't read Phaedo, but I knew that Socrates had to face sudden death on trial, and so this is what this work is about, Phaedo. And I just read a few introduction about this text that mentions the fact that it's how a philosopher would face death and maybe reflect on life at this time.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Yeah. So I want to know more about it.
Okay. No, absolutely. No, I think that was actually a really great point. That one of the things that we get set up here, right at the beginning of the story, is that this is, just before we're hearing the telling of what's happening just before Socrates' death. And so we're actually really that this is like the death, and kind of does the soul continue after death is very much the theme of this work. I would say, and I would describe the goal of the Phaedo is to give arguments for the existence of the soul, like the continuation of the soul after death. But again, just like you had just pointed out, Valentine, the story actually begins by a very, very important person who is actually about to or is about to die. And so this question is very much relevant and in everyone's mind. I'm going to skip over some other things. One of the things that's interesting is Plato always, he does this in other dialogues as well. And I couldn't tell you exactly which ones they are, but he always has himself, he tends to not be there. So Plato, if I'm not mistaken, was ill. Who was present there? This is, of course, Plato writing, and Plato says, Plato, if I was not mistaken, was ill. So Plato actually, in his presentation, was himself not there, which is interesting. Okay, cool. Let me figure out exactly where we want to pick up here. Yes. Yeah. Okay. Valentine, you want to actually read this piece here?
Okay.
It's going to be a bit, but yeah, go for it.
I can't see any text.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I will begin at the beginning and endeavor to repeat the entire conversation. You must understand that we had been previously in the habit of assembling early in the morning at the court in which the trial was held, and which is not far from the prison. There we remained talking with one another until the opening of the prison doors, for they were not opened very early, and then went in and generally passed the day with Socrates. On the last morning, the meeting was earlier than usual. This was owing to our having heard on the previous evening that the sacred ship had arrived from Delos, and therefore we agreed to meet very early at the accustomed place. On our going to the prison, the jailer who answered the door, instead of admitting us, came out and bade us wait, and he would call us. For the 11, he said. And now with Socrates, they are taking off his chains and giving orders that he is to die today. He soon returned and said that we might come on. On entering, we found Socrates just released from chains and Xantippe, whom you know, sitting by him and holding his child in her arms. When she saw us, she uttered a cry and said, as a woman will, "O Socrates, this is the last time that either you will converse with your friends, or they will die with you." Socrates turned to Phaedo and said, "Phaedo, let someone take her home." Some of Phaedo's people accordingly led her away, crying out and beating herself. And when she was gone, Socrates, sitting up on the couch, began to bend and rub his leg, saying as he rubbed, "How singular is the thing called pleasure, and how curiously related to pain, which might be thought to be the opposite of it. For they never come to a man together, and yet he who pursues either of them is generally compelled to take the other. They are two, and yet they grow together out of one head or stem. And I cannot help thinking that if Aesop has noticed them, he would have made a fable about God trying to reconcile their strife. And when he could not, he fastened their heads together. And this is the reason why when one comes, the other follows. As I found in my own case, pleasure comes following after the pain in my leg, which was caused by the chain."
Okay, perfect. Okay, this was good. That was already a lot. Okay, so Valentine, is there anything here that you kind of want to note? This is probably a little too much, but is there anything here that jumped out to you that you want to make note of?
This is a moment in which Socrates is brought to consider his condition, present condition
Mm-hmm.
and to understand deeply what is going on.
Mm-hmm.
He's being reminded what he will never do again, and what is precious about life.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Talking to his friends, for instance. So this is a way to emphasize the drama of the moment for him.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So very good. I agree with that. I'm going to make a couple other small comments really quick. So one is, not that this is a big deal. I always just find this super interesting. One thing in ancient Greece, this is not so relevant for the philosophy, but I just always find this so interesting. Is you'll notice that Xanthippe, when she gets escorted out, she is literally beating herself, which was just like a normal way actually for people to grieve in ancient Greece. So if in particular women, it appears in literature. I'm pretty sure there's some instances of men doing it as well. But basically, that's just kind of a side note. But I think that is interesting that our grieving habits would be culturally like that, because someone beating themselves today, to me, like this, this literally does mean like beating herself. And you see that in other places. In ancient Greek literature as well. That's not so important, but it's just I just find it super interesting. Sorry, we're already more advanced in the time than I had planned. So what I'm going to actually highlight here is that Socrates, kind of one of the first points he makes, actually becomes one of the main points in chapter 1. Essentially, depending on where your translation makes the chapter delineations, but that he kind of notes about opposites, that you have pain and pleasure in this particular example, but he does generalize this to other opposites later, which we'll see in just a minute. That pain and pleasure, for example, are opposites, but you need both. You need pain and pleasure to get either one. And that also one of the things that we'll actually take a look at. We'll take a look at that. I don't know, Seth, is there anything you want to comment in here? If not,
between pain and pleasure. Oh, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. I was gonna say like the interesting. It's like kind of like a minor point, but like the dichotomy of pleasure and pain, which probably led to later Epicurean thought, possibly maybe even Stoicism. But I just was thinking when I read that when I was reading along that I would almost differ in saying that they're not the opposite, but like actually, because he mentions that they're close together, that's probably more of like the opposite wouldn't be each other, but actually be indifference. But that's just a thought that I came up with while reading that.
Okay, interesting. Yeah. Well, we will. Yeah. I mean, I think that's a fair point. Yeah. Sounds good. I don't have anything to. Sorry, I'm listening.
One, I don't remember where it was, but I've heard this mentioned a few times before, that a lot of times when translating these works, that sometimes when a Greek philosopher or sometimes even a Roman philosopher mentions the pantheon, they usually condense it down into the singular word God rather than gods.
That can absolutely happen.
So I'm wondering if that's possibly the case here. I do know that I think it's called henotheism.
Yes, that's definitely almost for sure. I understand your point now. Yes, that is almost for sure the case. Yeah, that's a very good point. Mm-hmm. Sorry, keep going.
Oh, sorry. I know Plato was probably something of a henotheist, but I don't know much about the beliefs of Socrates, definitely because he doesn't have anything written or anything surviving. So, like, we are basically left up to Plato and I think Xenophon and like a few other people who wrote about him.
Absolutely.
Um,
Absolutely.
it's left up to interpretation.
Yeah. But I think it's very fair to say that a lot of, early Christians, or, not even that early Christians, when Christians did a lot of the work in translating Plato, and you definitely get a lot of the kind of that choice to use God in the singular appears a lot in a way that it probably, and we could take a look at the original text. I don't know exactly what it says, but yeah, it's very unlikely that it says God in the original text like that right there. Actually, speaking of that point, just super quick, Valentine, do you know how these texts are transmitted to us today? Like how we have any Plato texts when Plato, for example, lived 2,500 years ago, approximately. And so if he lived 2,500 years ago, like anything, if he wrote on a piece of parchment, there's no way that parchment lasted today. So like, how do we have any Plato text? Do you know that, Valentine?
Well, I'd say this is thanks to the generations of libraries and archivists.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, certainly that's true more in the Middle Ages. Yeah, so you would have originally, of course, so this would be like two sentences, since it looks like you guys both know this. How we would have texts that get handed from the ancient world down to today, including the entire Bible, for example, is that you would literally have individual people copying those pages, making a copy and passing it along. So that's how we could get additional copies, because we don't have a single copy, of course, and also and those are extremely valuable because, first of all, 99% of the ancient Greek population could not read. You may have some, if you were not essentially rich, you could not read unless you were a slave who was actually taught to read and write so that you could make copies for your slave master or do your accounting for your slave master. And so, you would not. So very few people would be able to read and write, and these copies would take an enormous amount of time. But that's not that. That sounds like it's clear to us, anyways. So, and those would get passed along. And so, of course, there is also the possibility, a guaranteed possibility of mistakes occurring kind of in that line of transmission, which we can attempt to solve by comparing different versions and blah blah blah. But that's good. You guys, I can tell you guys both know that, so that is great. Okay, sounds good. Let me see where we are right now.
Why do you say, inquired Cebes, that a man ought not to take his own life, but that the philosopher will be ready to follow the dying? Let's continue?
Yeah, keep going, yeah.
Socrates replied, and have you, Cebes and Simmias, who are acquainted with Philolaus, never heard him speak of this? I never understood him, Socrates. My words, too, are only an echo. But I am very willing to say what I have heard, and indeed, as I am going to another place, I ought to be thinking and talking of the nature of the pilgrimage which I'm about to make. What can I do better in the interval between this and the setting of the sun? Tell me then, Socrates, why is suicide held not to be right, as I have certainly heard Philolaus affirm when he was staying with us at Thebes. And there are others who say the same, although none of them has ever made me understand them. But do your best, replied Socrates, and the day may come when you will understand. I suppose that you wonder why, as most things which are evil may be accidentally good. This is to be the only exception, for may not death too be better than life in some cases?
Okay, very good. So we're gonna pause here. So now jump actually to here.
I can't see it. It's blocked off by the. Yet I too believe that the gods are our guardians and that we are possession of theirs. Do you not agree?
Yep, keep going. Sorry.
Yes, I agree to that, said Cebes. And one of your own possessions, an ox or an ass, for example, took the liberty of putting himself out to the way when you had given no intimation of what you wish that he should die. would you not be angry with him, and would you not punish him if you could?
Okay. No, it sounds good. So no problem. So one of the things that one of the points that Socrates has made that we did skip over is that one of the things that he says is that, I'm no worse off dying. So this is something that Seth just said, that he says, I'm no worse off now going to be dying. So that's one of the points that he makes is like, he really doesn't believe, you can tell that Socrates really doesn't believe that he's going to be worse off through dying. Because obviously there is this question, we're all like, what's going to happen when we die? And Socrates is like, at the worst, I'm probably going to be about the same as I am now. But there's also a chance I'm going to be better. We did kind of skip over that. But that's an idea that we've all heard before as well, that after death, it's actually better rather than worse. And so then comes, and I've heard other people still pose this question as well, is, well, if we're better off dead, then why don't we just kill ourselves? And so the answer that we get in this case, now, one of the things about Plato's dialogues are, and you really notice this once you've read them like a couple of times, is that he's usually not trying to give the answer. Sometimes he is, actually, but in my opinion, but frequently he's trying to give suggestive arguments. He's trying to give arguments that he thinks are valid, or sometimes he also gives arguments he thinks are not valid. That's also sometimes clear. But he does these dialogues in which different characters share opinions and kind of their own thoughts and their own philosophizing, and that's kind of how he records philosophy. And usually most things that Socrates says, we can take, if Socrates presents an argument, we can take it as something that it's not something that Plato necessarily is going to agree with, but it's going to be something that Plato is giving real credence to, because just in Plato's mind, it's very clear, like, Socrates is the man, essentially. And so we have Socrates here saying, well, the reason that we can't kill ourselves is actually because we are owned by the gods, and because we are essentially like something like slaves to the gods, or we are just, we are here to do the bidding of the gods. It is not really our right to decide to kill ourselves. So if we are alive, if the gods haven't killed us yet, it's because we have a purpose, which we're supposed to be fulfilling. We have a telos. I'll actually write it in the chat. It would be a Greek word, telos, teleological, meaning purpose filled. But if we're still alive and the gods haven't killed us yet, it's because they want us to still do something. And so, kind of killing ourselves is taking away the power of the gods. And he makes an analogy to a mule. If you own a mule and the mule decided to kill itself, wouldn't you be annoyed? Because you're like, I want to use that mule to do my, what is that called? Sowing of my seed, for example. So that's actually an argument that is picked up later by early Christians, for sure. I mean, that's something that I've even heard, in my lifetime, is like a legitimate argument that it's kind of like, God is supposed to decide when you die, essentially. And so that's an argument that has certainly not completely died out till today.
I was thinking of his topic of suicide and death and life and all that later on Seneca has a really good work on the shortness of life that discusses a lot of the same things, but almost comes to slightly different points, where he almost advocates that it's okay to commit suicide if you fulfilled life.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't know what his religious sentiments are on that.
Yeah, and well, there's a certain irony here. That's a very interesting point that you bring that up, because there's a certain irony to that in two ways. Like, first of all, Socrates is going to actually be killing himself, so he's forced to actually commit suicide. Like, he's not really committing suicide in the sense that he doesn't really want to die. Like, the state is requiring him to commit suicide, but the state doesn't like chop off his head or something, but he actually is forced to drink poison that kills him. And the second point that's interesting is, and it's not in this dialogue, but there is another one, which is not coming to my mind immediately, but basically where a friend is trying to convince Socrates to escape. And Socrates' argument actually for not escaping is that he is, an Athenian citizen, and and if you care to uphold the laws and blah, 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 and you kind of care about this state, then if the state convicts you, what credence would I have? What credence would my beliefs have if I choose to kind of flee, flee this death, essentially? But in a certain sense, also, he actually even had the opportunity to live, and he chose death, essentially. He didn't really choose death because he's been put to death, but in a very real sense, he could have gotten out of prison. He could have had somebody kind of bribe somebody and escaped and kind of flee as an exile, and he actively makes the choice not to do that. And so there is even there's a bit of irony here that he's speaking out against suicide, but then in a very real sense, he is actually going to be the one killing himself. He is allowing his own death. And also, by the way, you guys know the story. I don't know if you do know the story of, there's also these questions of, in the trial, he probably could have gotten out of the trial or gotten off with a lighter punishment than being put to death for instructing the youth or corrupting their minds or worshiping gods not sanctioned by the state. If he would have done the kind of typical theatrics of cry and be like, look, I have children, I don't want to leave my children behind, blah, blah, blah. And instead he's like, I want free lunches every day for the rest of my life for educating these students. And so this is his trial, and all the jurors are offended, essentially, that he's so bluntly being like, give me free lunch instead of sentencing me to death. And so there's also the question of well, he probably wasn't even originally planned to get the death penalty, but they gave him the toughest penalty possible because of how he acted. So there's all these undertones are also kind of there in this irony of him being like, you can't choose your own over death, which he kind of is doing himself. Okay, Valentine, do you want to pick up here? Good. Okay, you want to pick up here then really quick?
And now I will make answer to you, O my judges, and show that he who has lived as a true philosopher has reason to be of good cheer when he is about to die, and that after death he may hope to receive the greatest good in the other world. And how this may be, Simmias and Cebes, I will endeavor to explain. For I deem that the true disciple of philosophy is likely to be misunderstood by other men. They do not perceive that he is ever pursuing death and dying. And if this is true, why, having had the desire of death all his life long, should he repine at the arrival of that which he had been always pursuing and desiring?
Okay, perfect. So we're going to pause here. I'm going to make a quick comment really quick. One of the other things Plato is actually attempting to do in his dialogues is actually kind of establish the field of philosophy as legitimate. Socrates is literally getting, or was also as a historical fact, sentenced to death for corrupting the minds of the youth. And a part of that is, it really is partially the introduction of philosophy, where people are kind of thinking about these wacky ideas and coming up with new ideas themselves and blah, blah, blah. But it's also you ask all these questions why do we worship these gods? Why? And it's kind of whoa, you're really crossing our boundaries of what we kind of automatically accept. So anyways, I don't want to conflate my two kind of thoughts here, but my first is, we will see that Plato is, or you'll notice in other Plato dialogues as well, that Plato is really trying to establish philosophy as a legitimate field. And secondly, what he's describing it here as, what Socrates is describing it here, is as he's trying to pursue death. The philosopher desires death. We'll see essentially that what Plato describes as death is, does anybody know really quick? So he describes death essentially as a perfect separation of soul and body, where when you die, the moment of death is when your soul is completely liberated from your body. And one of the things that comes up again and again in this dialogue is what philosophers are trying to do is constantly push out the world, essentially, push out anything bodily, push out anything corporeal, and focus entirely on the mind. And so in that sense, it's a practice of death. And so Socrates being, there's a certain irony that if a philosopher fears death, like, well, you've been desiring death this whole time. You've been desiring for your mind to be freed from your body this entire time.
Do we believe that there is such a thing as death? To be sure, replied Simmias. And is this anything but the separation of soul and body? And being dead is the attainment of the separation. When the soul exists in herself and is parted from the body, and the body is parted from the soul, that is death. That and nothing else, he replied. Do you think that the philosopher ought to care about the pleasures if they are to be called pleasures of eating and drinking? Certainly not, answered Simmias. And what do you say of the pleasures of love? Should he care about them? By no means. And will he think much of the other ways of indulging the body, for example? In matters of this sort, philosophers, above all other men, may be observed in every sort of way to decipher the soul from the body. But that he who thinks nothing of bodily pleasures is almost as though he were dead.
Perfect. Very good. Thank you so much, Valentine. What is it that the philosopher is attempting to do in life? Should the philosopher care about the pleasures of love? Should the philosopher care to pursue, essentially pleasures of love? I interpret that. I'm assuming this word is eros here in the original Greek. Pleasures of love and sex, for example. What about the pleasures of eating and drinking, which we enjoy? Or should he, the adornments of the body, or should he despise these? And the answer is, I would say that the true philosopher should despise them. The true philosopher should despise these kind of these pleasures that feel so important to us on a daily basis. Eating something delicious, of course, the erotic pleasures, the pleasures of, for example, adornments of the body, wearing something beautiful, blah, 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 feeling comfortable. And he says the true philosopher should despise them. One of the main goals is for the philosopher to be able to separate essentially his mind entirely from the corporeal world. And so therefore all these pleasures are actually really distractions that pull your mind away from, achieving its best. And that's actually not something that's like that dissimilar from example from like in Buddhism, being an ascetic, for example, is very important that you have long periods where you even deny your body like food sometimes, like not to the point of, starvation, but the Buddha almost starved to death and actually achieved his enlightenment. You have the impression, the way the story is told, and I don't want to repeat it falsely, but essentially that he was like not far from death. He was not far from starving himself to death. Even obviously fasting is a part of like modern Christianity, as well as certainly very prevalent in Ramadan, for example, in Islam, blah, blah, blah. And so kind of the separation of the mind from the body to focus on the holy, in the religious world, or to focus entirely on the mind, as Socrates here is arguing. And so we shouldn't be despising these kind of pleasures that just distract us from the truth, which I'm not sure I personally agree with, but that's neither here nor there. That's Socrates' argument.
Well, but there is another thing, Simmias. Is there or is there not an absolute justice? Assuredly there is. And an absolute beauty and absolute good? Of course. But did you ever behold any of them with your eyes? Certainly not. Or did you ever reach them with any other bodily sense? And I speak not of these alone, but of absolute greatness and health and strength and essence of true nature of everything. Has the reality of them ever been perceived by you through the bodily organs? Or rather, has not the nearest approach to the knowledge of their several natures made by him who so orders his intellectual vision as to have the most exact conception of the essence of that which he considers? certainly, and he attains to the knowledge of them of them in their highest purity, who goes to each of them with the mind alone, not allowing when in the act of the thought of the intrusion or the introduction of sight or any other sense in the company of reason, but with the very light of the mind and her clearness penetrates into the very fight of truth in each. He has got rid, as far as he can, of eyes and ears and of the whole body, which he conceives of only a disturbing element, hindering the soul from acquisition of knowledge when in company with her, is not of the sort of man who, if man ever did, is likely to attain knowledge of existence.
Okay. Can you summarize or tell me anything about what you just read?
I wonder if this is like kind of like Descartes' reason of doubt, where we cannot fully trust our senses, but we can have like an idea of like a perfect form of beauty and a perfect form of justice, and then we can see things and like kind of like take them in.
When I think of Descartes, I think of that kind of radical skepticism of like the cogito ergo sum, like I think therefore I am, like I can trust that I know that I'm thinking because I can perceive that I'm thinking, and if I exist, if I am thinking because I'm doubting, and because I think, I can also deduce from that I exist. Like one thing I can be very, very confident of, even if all of reality is a fake, I can be very confident that I exist. That's kind of what so I think there was some tones that, like the second point that you made, if he has kind of these points around absolute beauty and absolute good and absolute justice, that's definitely building on Plato, not the other way around, obviously. I don't know anything about that in Descartes. It does not surprise me that it's there, but I don't know anything about it there. But you did hit on something very important, which is absolute beauty, absolute good. Do you guys know anything about the Platonic forms? Does that term bring anything to mind?
Yeah. If I'm kind of hazy on it, because it's one of those ideas that is like it's intentionally abstract, but I think so one example I've heard is everyone has seen a chair, everyone has sat in a chair, but and so we all have this idea of a chair, so therefore there's this perfect chair that is what all other chairs are based on.
Yes.
Something like that.
Absolutely. Or even alternatively, I think the phrase that would be like the way that I would associate with that is like there's a chair that all other chairs like aspire to be and are attempting to be. Absolutely. So one of the things about I'm very, very interested in the Platonic forms. I don't really fully understand them, but I do know I've read a very good bit about them. In particular, there's like 5 forms that are of particular interest. That would be the beautiful, the good, the just, the equal, beautiful, good, just, equal, and one more. And so the argument, and actually this comes in the Phaedo too. We're actually not going to read to their because you can see it's a long text. But right in the middle of the Phaedo, actually, there are actually like really strong arguments, and the argument that's used is actually for the equal, where he says that knowledge is simply recollection. So all knowledge is recollection, meaning all knowledge is things that we recollect. One example of this is that if you put a question to a person in the right way, he will give a true answer of himself, even if he doesn't know already. But basically, one example is all knowledge is recollection. When I look at a beautiful landscape, I know that the landscape is beautiful without somebody having to teach me that. When I look at a beautiful landscape, an idea of beauty comes to my mind, And I haven't had to be taught that. Nobody ever had to teach me this is what beautiful is. Now, obviously, you're going to get plenty of sociologists in the 21st century who are going to say, you are taught what beautiful is. And obviously, there is also some truth to that. Like if we think about, fashion, for example, if I look at what was beautiful in, different time periods on people, for example, or architecture also, like I'm not a fan of the 1950s. I'm a big fan of the 1890s and not a big fan of the 1950s. We are taught, at least partially, what beautiful is, but there's no doubt, essentially, that we can look at a landscape or we can hear a piece of music for the first time, and we know that something is beautiful and we don't have to be taught it. Same with good. Most of us have an ability to kind of look at good or look at things and know that they're good. He uses the example here of equal. So like I have here 2 batteries. You can look at these batteries and get the idea that these batteries are equal. Are these batteries truly equal? No. One may be more charged than the other one, for example. This one may have more charge than the other one. Also, obviously, they have different positions in space and time. They may have different ages, blah, blah, blah. Like they're not the same battery, right? But if I didn't show you, you would be like, well, they're the same, they're equal. And so that's actually the example he uses in this dialogue. So in our previous one, he uses the same term here. There's a question it's around absolute good, absolute beauty. Socrates states essentially that there is an absolute good and that there is an absolute beauty, blah, 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 which are essentially, as I would put it, like ontologically independent. They are like ontologically independent of instantiations of them. So, for example, there exists an absolute beauty. That means like kind of like the idea of beauty. But what actually truly is beautiful, it actually exists separately from any instantiation of the landscape. So it's kind of like embedded into the fabric of the universe. Like embedded into the fabric of the universe, there's the idea there is like what actually is beautiful. And then things like the landscape participate in that beauty. So like if you have a beautiful landscape or a beautiful human, these things strive to participate in the beautiful or participate in the good. They can't do it fully, but we have an idea of when we look at something, we don't have to, first of all, we never have to be taught what beautiful is, or we never have to be taught what good is, which is interesting because obviously in a certain sense, we do have to be taught what good and beautiful are. But in many ways also, we really don't. And also like even children intuitively have the idea. And so he says all knowledge is memory, because the idea here, to kind of sum up a couple pages of this argument, we haven't actually read this text, but this is actually probably the most important part of the Phaedo, is that we look at something and we get this idea of beauty, or like get this idea of equal. The only way we could get the idea of equal, even though these are not actually equal, is because they remind us of what equal is. And that means in order for these things to remind us of remind us of the equal, that's because we already know what the equal is, which means essentially that we already have knowledge in us. So we look at these things, they're not equal, but we have the impression that they're equal. And this is true for like a 1-year-old. A 1-year-old doesn't have to be taught. These things are closer to equal than these things. Like a 1-year-old doesn't have to be taught that. And why not? It's because it's inherent. If that knowledge in us is inherent, if that knowledge of what the equal is inherent in us, that means that, we already have it. And if we already have it, well, we must have acquired it somewhere. And so that's actually for him an argument that the soul is eternal, that the soul, we've actually lived previous lives, because we wouldn't be able to know that these, we wouldn't be able to remember what equal is. We wouldn't be able to access that knowledge without having it been given to us if, essentially at the moment of birth, if it hadn't been given to us prior to birth. So I hope that kind of made sense. It's kind of a wacky argument, Seth, I see your face. I'd love to hear kind of what your reactions are to that.
It's basically throwing out the whole John Locke's blank slate argument about how we actually come to this earth with a form of knowledge. We have like an inbuilt mechanism of understanding certain things. Now we know it's more akin to physiology. Like we have the physiology of our voice box, the anatomy of our brain that orchestrates different placements of like thoughts and patterns of our biological mechanisms. But anyways, I'm kind of getting off topic. But when it comes to understanding vision and like language, that is also a genetic component as well.
I understand what you're saying. So I think that's interesting, and absolutely, I think the skepticism is entirely merited, and I'm plenty skeptical myself. What I'm trying to do is give the argument rather than like argue for the argument. If you see what I'm saying. Now, one of the things that's very essential to his argument is that there is, and this is actually what caught me in the section that we just read, is that there is this assumption, essentially, that there is an absolute good, there is an absolute goodness, there is an absolute equal, which I'm like, why does there have to be an absolute equal? Like, that's something that I kind of struggle with, where I'm like, I do understand it. I almost do get it almost with like absolute good. But like an absolute equal, for example, I'm like, why does there have to be an absolute equal? Or you, Seth, used the example earlier of chair. Like, why does there have to be kind of like this ontologically independent idea that's absolute of chair, that all chairs are trying to participate in? Like, why does that have to be a part of it? Obviously, chair, I think I've heard different arguments. I like to stick to the five big ones. Again, truth, beauty, good, equal, and one that I'm missing, which I can't remember right now, but that's okay. So he's saying there is this absolute equal. When we look at these two things, which are not equal, we are reminded of that equal, and that's where we get the idea that these are equal. We have to know that absolute equal already in order to be reminded of that equal, and therefore our soul must have, because that's true even at the moment of birth, essentially, we must have had knowledge at the moment of birth. And in order to have knowledge at the moment of birth, our soul must have been there prior to the moment of birth. Essentially, and so therefore we must have had past lives. That is Plato's argument, and also by the fact that we have these past lives. One of the other things, let me look at the time. One of the other things that he gets to. Let's actually jump forward and read this.
And do not courageous men endure death because they are afraid of yet greater evils? That is true. Then all but the philosophers are courageous only from fear and because they are afraid. And yet that a man should be courageous from fear and because he is a coward is surely a strange thing. Very true. And are not the temperate exactly in the same case? They are temperate because they are intemperate, which may seem to be a contradiction, but is nevertheless the sort of thing which happens with this foolish temperance. For there are pleasures which they must have and are afraid of losing, and therefore they abstain from one class of pleasures because they are overcome by another. And whereas intemperance is defined as being under the dominion of pleasure, they overcome only because they are overcome by pleasure. And that is what I mean by saying that they are temperate through intemperance. That appears to be true.
Okay, so let's actually pause here and just talk about what we just read, and then we're going to talk about this really quick. So, Valentine, can you kind of summarize what you had just read, for example, about the temperate as well as the brave? So, for example, this sentence, and do not courageous men endure death because they are afraid of yet greater evils? So the point that's being made here is that courageous men, you are brave and you'll go out and fight for something. You'll go out and fight for your freedom. Why? Because you fear losing your freedom more than you fear losing your life. But the point is, either way, you have fear. That people who are courageous actually fear a life without freedom, and so therefore are willing to risk their lives in order to obtain freedom, for example. Or the same thing, he makes temperate. So temperate meaning like, I don't drink too much alcohol. I don't, I may drink some alcohol, but I don't drink too much alcohol. Or I go to bed early, so I'm not tired in the morning. What is the logic of that? The logic of that is that the temperate abstain from pleasure. So they say, I don't want to get too drunk. I don't want to party all night because I want to be able to have a good day tomorrow. The point here is, either way, the temperate, just like the intemperate, are prioritizing their pleasure. It's just that the temperate are prioritizing their pleasure, essentially their productive pleasure, whilst the intemperate are kind of prioritizing their not temperate pleasure. But the point is, either way, the temperate are actually pleasure seeking. The temperate are actually pursuing pleasure, and the brave are actually people who fear something else. And so he's making this point around arguments, which was, you'll remember, around opposites, where he's saying actually opposites stem from their opposites. So the brave men fear losing their freedom. So brave men fear losing their freedom. So the opposite springs from the other. The one springs from the other. For example, the temperate pursue temperance. They pursue acting, in moderation, because they actually want to pursue the pleasure of life, for example. So, Seth, I'm going to ask you to read this if that's okay, and this will be the last point.
Whether the souls of men after death are not in the world below is a question which may be argued in this manner.
Actually, sorry, hold on one second. So just a side note, in case you guys don't know, in the world below, so the ancient Greeks believed the afterlife happened essentially under the earth. And so the world below is essentially and that's probably where the idea of hell comes from. That's not the ancient Greeks are not the only culture that kind of believe that. But so the point is, essentially this means in whatever we would call wherever the afterlife happens. So that's what the world below means in this context. Sorry, you can keep going.
Chthonic, if I think the correct term is for believing in afterlife, is under the ground rather than up above.
Okay, but, that makes sense. Kath being downwards, yeah, that makes sense.
Whether the souls of men after death are or not in the world below is a question which may be argued in this manner. The ancient doctrine of which I have been speaking affirms that they go from this into the other world and return hither, and are and are born from the dead. Now, if this be true, and the living come from the dead, then our souls must be in the other world. For if not, how could they be born again? And this would be conclusive if there are any real evidence that the living are only born from the dead. But if there is no evidence of this, then other arguments will have to be adduced. That is very true.
Dude, keep going. Sorry, keep going. Yeah.
Oh. That is very true, replied Stevens. Then let us consider this question, not in relation to man only, but in relation to animals generally, and to plants, and to everything of which there is generation. And the proof will be easier. Are not all things which have opposites generated out of their opposites? I mean, such things are as good and evil, just and unjust, and there are innumerable other opposites which are generated out of opposites. And I want to show that this holds universally of all opposites. I mean to say, for example, that anything which becomes greater must become greater after being less. True. And that becomes less must have been greater, once greater, and then become less. Yes, and the weaker is generated from the stronger, the swifter from the slower, and the worse from the better, and the more just from the more unjust. Of course, and this is true of all opposites, and we are convinced that all of them are generated out of opposites. And yes, and this universal opposition of all things.
Perfect. Hold on. So 1 second. So we get that point. We'll, if we didn't, I'll summarize it in just 1 second. So then jump here.
Okay. Well, that and well, and there is not an opposite of life, as sleep is the opposite of waking. True, he said. And what is that? Death, he answered. And these then are generated if they are opposites from the other, and have their two in. Okay, it's like kind of blocking that sentence right there. Okay, and have their two intermediate processes also. Of course. Now.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Seth. Okay, so let's start back here. So Seth, can you summarize kind of this first argument? This one that was, I guess it wasn't even an argument. It's just saying, he's basically saying, yeah, there's an ancient doctrine that says that that affirms that souls exit this world at death, go into the other world, and then return here and are born again from the dead. So there's actually an ancient legend, according to Socrates, that this is already true. And then, and if this is true, if that the living come from the dead, then our souls must go into the other world, because otherwise, how could they be born again? So in order for the living to come from the dead, then the dead also have to come from the living, obviously, and that's pretty obvious. The dead come from the living, right. So you have to have it working in both directions. That's clear enough. Then he makes a point around opposites. Seth, you want to try and summarize the point around opposites?
Yeah, so it's basically saying that, like, if one thing exists, its opposite has to also exist. And that, like, if one changes, then the other automatically changes, whether it becomes greater or lesser.
So, yeah, I think that's pretty good. The first point is actually 100% true, I think. The first one that you said is, if for something to exist, its opposite has to exist. But when I say opposite, they're really adjectives. When he says opposites, he's talking about adjectives. So like this is like we have greater and less, or it probably, I don't know exactly what it says, but it could also be read as bigger and smaller, stronger and weaker, swifter and slower, worse and better, just and unjust. So he's using all adjectives. So he's basically saying, in order to say that I'm big, or in order to say that I'm tall, I have to have a comparison point from the short, for example. In order to say something is good, you have to have a comparison of bad, or in order to say something is bad, you have to have a comparison of what is good. So, in order to say somebody's fast, you have to know that what slow is. So these things, in order for these things to work, all adjectives essentially generate out of the opposite adjective. You need both in order for either one to have any meaning. And I think there's some truth to that. If we think about like life and death, like a rock obviously is neither alive nor dead. And the reason that a dead body is dead in a way that a rock is not dead is because there was life there. And so death is very much generated out of life, because again, if you see like a dead squirrel on the road, the reason it's a dead squirrel and not just like a rock is because it was once alive. So the death is actually very much generated from the life. And, if we follow this pattern, like all other adjectives essentially, where every adjective is generated from the other adjective, and also we look at the fact that death is clearly generated from life, then it follows that life is generated from death. And so that's also what he uses as another argument to kind of make this cyclical point. So this is the point around the opposites. Again, these arguments are not necessarily intended to be conclusive for an afterlife, but they are intended to certainly be suggestive. And so we can make our own decisions. Okay, I'm going to wrap up here because I see we have 2 minutes left and I don't like to go over. So first of all, thank both of you guys so much. I do see that the person who was Diana, who we never heard talk, did leave about 10 minutes ago. So I hope she had a good time too. I thank you very much for joining me here. I do really enjoy this. I am hoping to do my PhD actually in the New Testament. I'm in Vienna, Austria right now. This is not my real background. This is fake. This is all fake. You'd actually be my very boring looking bedroom. But yes, so I really appreciate you joining me here. So a couple things I want to share with you. So first of all, if you know people, if you had a great time, I appreciate your joining. I have a rotating set of 4 sample classes that are like this. I do Plato. I do